Okay, so I was talking about the source of the teachings on emptiness. So they actually come from the second Dharma wheel, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And there's many Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. Some are really long, like the longest one has 100,000 verses. It's like this big. And then there's a short one, like the Heart Sutra. That's one of the shortest ones. Also the Diamond Sutra or Vajra Sutra you may have heard of. That's where the Buddha spoke about emptiness. And it said that if you look in the middle of the page, it said there are two levels of meaning of the Perfection of Wisdom or Prajnaparamita Sutras. Explicit, that means what the Buddha was mainly talking about in a very direct way, is wisdom. In other words, the wisdom understanding emptiness. So that was the main subject matter. And then, so after the Buddha taught these Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, over the centuries after the Buddha passed away, those teachings were passed through various masters, such as Manjushri, Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, Shantideva. So there's a kind of lineage of the teachings on emptiness from the Buddha through these various teachers down to our present day teachers. And then the second is implicit. So that's kind of like if you read between the lines. You know that expression?
In Hebrew we say משתמע, ו-explicit זה מפורש. מפורש ומשתמע.
לא צריך לראות כל דבר בתנ"ך.
מפורש ומשתמע.
So then the implicit teachings explain the method side of the path, which means like compassion, bodhicitta, and how to progress along the path to enlightenment, 6 perfections and so on. And then those teachings were also passed through various masters, including Maitreya, Sangye, and so on and so on and so forth. So they came from the Buddha through these various masters. And then it says, these two are like the two wings of a bird. You've heard that expression, right? That you need these 2 wings, just as a bird needs 2 wings to be able to fly, we need 2 wings to fly to enlightenment. And the 2 wings are wisdom understanding reality, the true nature of things, and then the compassions, the method. Sometimes it's just called method, but what it means is compassion and love and bodhicitta and the first 5 perfections. So we need both of those. We can't reach enlightenment if we have only one, but not the other one. So these 2 lineages were eventually brought to Tibet by masters, great masters such as Shantarakshita, Kamalashila, Atisha. So these are Indian masters who came to Tibet in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries and brought these teachings with them. So then they were again transmitted through various masters down to Lama Tsongkhapa, who's the founder of the Gelug tradition that many of us follow. Yeah. And so that's how I have received these teachings. So my teachers, received them through the Gelug lineage. Now, the next point here is the 2 truths. Have you heard of the 2 truths before? Yes. Yeah, so that's not something new. But it's important to understand 2 truths because emptiness is one of the 2 truths. Emptiness is ultimate truth, at least in the Madhyamika school. And to fully understand ultimate truth, we also need to understand conventional truth. So again, it's like two things that are inseparable. Like we can't have only one and not the other. Okay, so there are 2 things that are both needed, and we need to understand them. So in a simple way, the 2 truths are conventional, ultimate. So we start with number 2, ultimate truths. Ultimate truths are emptinesses. And I'm saying emptinesses, plural, right? Sometimes we just say emptiness in the singular. which can make it sound as if there's only one emptiness. It's not completely accurate, because emptiness is actually many, multiple. And the way it works is, okay, so going back to number one, conventional truths. Conventional truths are everything that is an emptiness. Whatever isn't an emptiness is a conventional truth. So that includes us. Okay, each one of us is a person, a being, a human being, and our bodies, our minds, all the things in this room, cushions and papers and books and tables and chairs and the building itself, everything outside, the sea, the mountains, trees, buildings, everything, whatever exists, is a conventional truth. Okay, so that's kind of simple. Everything that is an emptiness is a conventional truth. But the reason I'm saying emptiness is multiple is because every conventional truth has emptiness as its real nature, its true nature. So emptiness is like a quality, a characteristic, a property of every single conventional truth. So that's why there's lots of emptinesses. As many conventional truths as there are that many emptinesses. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sort of. And it's also said that the two, the conventional truth and the ultimate truth, are inseparable in a way that, okay, let's say this cup is a conventional truth, and it has emptiness as a quality, a property, a characteristic. Its true nature, its real nature, the real nature of the cup is emptiness. Okay? Now the cup and its emptiness are not like contradictory things. They are different. They are two different things. We can't say they're the same thing. They're not the same thing, because if they were the same thing, when we see the cup, we would see the emptiness of the cup. Then it would be really easy to see emptiness. But, so they are two different things, but they are inseparable. We cannot separate the cup and the emptiness of the cup, at least in a real way. You know, we can't put the cup here and the emptiness of the cup somewhere else. Wherever the cup is, the emptiness of the cup is right there. You can't separate them. So they're said to be one nature. One nature. That's the expression they used in Buddhist philosophy. They are one nature. And one nature or one entity means they can't be separated. They come into existence together. So when the cup was produced in the factory or wherever it was made, China, looks like China. Okay, so a factory somewhere in China made this cup. Okay, so when the cup came into existence, it became a final product. At the same time, its emptiness came into existence. Not later, not before, but at the same time, simultaneously. The emptiness of the cup came into existence at the same time as the cup. And as long as the cup is there, its emptiness is there. One day the cup's going to get dropped on the floor and shattered into pieces or burned in a fire or whatever. It's going to go out of existence. So when it goes out of existence, the emptiness of the cup will also go out of existence. So they're like inseparable. The cup and its emptiness are always together, but yet they're not the same thing. They're two different things. I don't know if that's important for you right now, but maybe we'll come back to it later. But it is emphasized that a conventional truth and its emptiness do not contradict each other. They don't contradict each other. It is important because some people think they do. Some people think that emptiness and conventional truths are like totally contradictory, totally opposite, totally, you know, you can only have one but not the other. But according to Chandrakirti, the great master we study in Tibetan tradition, they're not contradictory. Okay, so we'll probably come back to that later, but it is important. The Dalai Lama says it's really important to understand the two truths. although it's not always easy. But he says, when he gives advice on how to come to an understanding of Buddhism, for those of us who are not born Buddhists, we're not born into Buddhist families, we come to Buddhism later in life when we're in our 20s or 30s or 40s or 50s or whatever. We start learning Buddhism, coming from some other background. So the question is, well, how should we learn Buddhism? What's the right way to learn Buddhism? And his advice is 4 truths, 4 noble truths, and 2 truths. Start with that. 4 noble truths and the 2 truths. Although 2 truths is not so easy. 4 noble truths is relatively easy, but the 2 truths is not so easy. But he says it's really important to understand. So it may take our whole life to understand the 2 truths, but it's worth it. And then down at the bottom, letter D, I just put this box with the 4 Buddhist systems of philosophy or schools of tenets. Because not all Buddhists are the same. Not all Buddhists explain things in the same way. And it's good to know that. Because if you meet somebody from some other tradition and you start talking and you find out, you're like, wait a minute, it's like we're not on the same page here. It's normal. It's understandable. So the Tibetans, they received the Buddhist teachings something like 1,200 years after the Buddha lived. That's a long time. 1,200 years. Okay? So during that period of time, for the Buddha until Buddhism came to Tibet, 1,200 years. So that gives a lot of time, for people, the Buddhists to discuss and write texts and argue and debate and, come up with different ideas, which is exactly what happened. Okay, so after the Buddha, there were all these different discussions that took place. What did the Buddha mean by this? What did the Buddha mean by that? Why did he say this? So there arose different schools, different systems of explaining the Buddhist teachings. But also, it's partly because the Buddha himself gave different teachings, right? He didn't always say the same thing to everybody. So this is why there arose these different schools. So when they got to Tibet, the Buddhist teachings got to Tibet, the Tibetans kind of organized the different Buddhist traditions into these 4. Okay, so these are the 4 main traditions of Buddhist philosophy that developed in India. And we're not going to go into detail with these. In the monasteries, like the Gelugpa monasteries, the monks and nuns will study these 4 schools one by one. They go through them one by one and study them. And I've also heard when they study them, they don't just study them intellectually, but they discuss them. And they actually, Geshe Kelsang Wang was talking about this the other day, you actually have to act like you are becoming a follower of that school and defend it, as if you are, one of the followers of this school, and then you have to defend their views against opponents and so on. So you have to put yourself into these schools, try to understand how they think, why they think the way they do. They say it's very good for sharpening your intelligence. So we don't have time to go into all this, but it's a very interesting study. And if you ever have a chance to do the basic program, I think Shuki wants to do that one of these days, the basic program. So one of the topics of the basic program is called tenets, T-E, not tennis like this. It's tenet, T-E-N-E-T, tenets. So that refers to, the word is here, yeah, schools of tenets. So tenets is like a view, an idea, a way of explaining things. So you go through these 4 and look at them one by one. But when it comes to an understanding of emptiness, it's also helpful to go through these 4 schools because normally the Tibetans, most Tibetans have a preference for the 4th school, number 4, Madhyamika, middle way school. And that has two divisions, Madhyamika Svatantrika and Madhyamika Prasangika. So they like the last one, Madhyamika Prasangika. They say that's the best, that's the highest, that's the most accurate. But it's also the most difficult. It's really, really difficult to understand that one. And so one of the reasons for going through the four schools is because if you go through the earlier ones and then gradually get to the last one, it's easier to understand the last one. If you just jump right in to the last one, then it's very hard to understand it. Which is what a lot of the lamas, the way they teach, this is what they teach. They teach the fourth one. They teach Madhyamika Prasangika. Yeah, and sometimes you feel like you've been thrown into the deep end of a swimming pool and you don't know how to swim, right? So, so that's why it's beneficial to go first with Vaibhashika, Sutrantika, Chittamatra, and then Madhyamika. Go one by one. Because analogy is, it's like a ladder. These different schools are like the steps of a ladder. So if you try to just jump to the top of the ladder, you might break your leg, right? But if you go step by step, one step at a time, then you get to the top and then you can manage. So I don't want to, we're not going to go into detail of with all of these, but just to talk in a brief way, because they have different views about the two truths, ultimate truths and conventional truths. And the first two schools, the Vaibhashika or Great Exposition School and the Sutrantika, the Sutra School, so those are called Hinayana schools because the goal of your practice is nirvana. Sometimes it's called self-liberation. You want to liberate yourself. You want to get yourself out of suffering, out of samsara. So that's your goal. You're not thinking about all sentient beings. Of course, they develop love and compassion and, all these positive qualities, but they don't think, I am going to take everybody out of samsara. That's not their idea. Just myself. Everybody for themselves. Okay, and then, so those two schools are kind of materialistic in a sense. I mean, I don't mean in the sense of, they want money, but in the sense of the way they understand reality. Their view is there's this objectively existing world out there. Things, like material things, physical things are made of particles. Yeah, tiny, tiny little particles. And they also believe that there's a basic, what do you call it, like a building block, basic building block, like Newtonian physics, yeah. You can break things down into smaller and smaller particles, but you finally get to the smallest particle. They can't be broken down any further. Okay, and that's like the basic unit. Dharma?
Dharma, she said.
I don't know what they call, I don't know what the name of it is, but some kind of particle that can't be broken down any further. And then those tiny particles come together to form bigger things. So that's, how everything exists. But they say these things exist objectively, meaning, they don't depend on our mind. They're out there. They're out there, they're real, and we just come along and see them. So it's a bit like old science, isn't it? The before quantum physics came along, what was believed in. I think still many scientists believe that, right? They still think there's this objective world out there. And, we just come along with our minds, our consciousness, and know them. But, so it's kind of a, concrete, materialistic, objective view of things. But still, they do say that things are made of these tiny particles, and they are changing moment by moment. Everything is changing moment by moment. Nothing stays the same from one moment to the next. So what we call subtle impermanence. And they meditate on that, and they actually get a realization of that, a direct realization of that. And that's super helpful for subduing your mind. Because when you see that nothing is staying the same from one moment to the next, then what is there to be attached to? What is there to get angry about? Right? So it really cools down your afflictive emotions. And they also say that mind is changing moment by moment. Mind is also something that can be broken down. It's not physical, like the wall, like our bodies. It's non-physical, but still it's made up of these moments of mind, moments of awareness, moments of consciousness that can be broken down. I've heard some estimates, they say, like in the snap of a finger there could be thousands or even millions of mind moments. Very, very, very brief. So brief we can't notice them. So they also say mind is not a solid thing. It's also made up of parts, and it's changing moment by moment by moment by moment by moment. And they can see that. If you're a yogi, if you're meditating, you can see that in your experience. So that also really helps you to break down, a sense of attachment to things being very concrete. And so, the teachings and practices of these schools is extremely helpful. But probably the most important teaching and practice is that of selflessness. Or sometimes it's called non-self, a lack of self. Non-self, selflessness. And this is something all Buddhist schools have. So all Buddhist schools talk about selflessness. This is something common to all Buddhist schools. But they have different ways of talking about selflessness. So I'm just not sure how much of this material to go through, but if you turn on page 2, letter G, right in the middle, 3 levels of selflessness. Okay? So this is the main thing I really wanted to focus on today and in the coming weeks. These different levels of selflessness, because I think it's helpful to go in this way rather than jumping in right away to the most subtle one, which is explained by the Madhyamika Prasangika. So if we go step by step from the very coarse to the coarse and then to the subtle one, then it might make more sense. Okay, so under the 3 levels of selflessness, the first one, number 1, is the very coarse. And this refers to the emptiness of a permanent, unitary, and independent self. Okay, so this is a kind of self, a kind of I, a kind of sense of me, who I am, how I exist. And it has these qualities or these properties. It's permanent, meaning it doesn't change. It's unitary, meaning you can't break it into parts. It's just one whole partless thing. Independent. Now, independent can have different meanings, but in this case, it means it doesn't depend on causes and conditions. So it isn't something that... Huh?
So, and karma depends on...
Well, karma is part of causes and conditions, but causes and conditions is a much bigger... This is a really important topic in Buddhism. There's a lot of talk about causes and conditions. Seeds, nature, trees and plants and so on, they come into existence from causes and conditions. Buildings come into causes and conditions. Our bodies come into existence from causes and conditions. So all things that are impermanent phenomena, whatever is an impermanent phenomena, comes into existence from causes and conditions. Everything has its causes. So karma is part of that. Karma is part of this whole system of causes and conditions, but it's just one part. This very coarse level of selflessness means that we, each one of us, and every other person, every other being, is empty of or lacks this kind of a self. Okay? Now, why do we even talk about this? because some people believe in this kind of a self. So at the time of the Buddha, before the Buddha, there were many philosophers and yogis in India. It was kind of a long tradition for many centuries, I think, of people who, like the Buddha, you know, they left their homes, they would go live in the forest, in the jungle, meditate, do yoga, smoke ganja, whatever. You know, they have their all kind of their own traditions, different things that they did. But it was, anyway, Buddha was just one of many of these kind of people. So prior to the Buddha, many of the philosophers and yogis of India believed in a kind of self. They used the term Atman. Have you heard of that term? It's a Hindu term. And so the Buddha was kind of revolutionary. He was really revolutionary, coming along and saying, there's no Atman. Everybody else believed there was. And so I was kind of curious the other day. I went on Wikipedia, Googled Wikipedia, to know exactly what did they believe. So I just took some notes. So Atman can mean essence, breath, or soul. So in Hinduism, it's a real self. It's eternal, imperishable, meaning it doesn't change momentarily. It's beyond time. It's something other than our body, or mind, or consciousness. But it permeates all of these. Permeate? Like suffuses. So it permeates, it suffuses our body and our mind and our consciousness, but it's other than them. It's something else, something other than them. And it's permanent, unchanging, and eternal. It exists forever.
The way it is, it doesn't change.
That's what they say.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they say.
Like it's a big category under this there's mind, body, and all.
No, it's other than mind and body. Something separate from mind and body. That's what they say. That's what it says in Wikipedia. I don't know who writes these articles in Wikipedia. If they're really reliable or not. They are reliable.
It's connected also to Brahman, right? It's connected to superpower.
So, shh, be quiet. So, it said there are 6 main Orthodox Hindu schools. There's some other sub-schools, but 6 main ones. And they all accept the existence of an Atman. And they all talk about the importance of knowing it, that we need to know the Atman. And they talk about self-knowledge, knowledge of the self, knowledge of the Atman. And that's like the main thing in life. But there are differences in how you get to know the Atman, how you do it. And one school, which I've heard nowadays, I think it's still quite popular, and also in the West, is called Vedanta, or the Vedas. The Vedas, I think, are very ancient texts, and so Vedanta is a school that studies the Vedas. And within Vedanta, there's Advaita, which means non-dualism, non-duality, and there's a Dvaita, which means dualism. So this non-dualistic school, they have quite an interesting view. They say each Atman, so each one of us has an Atman, this kind of eternal soul, and it's identical with Brahman. And Brahman is the universal soul. And there's just one universal soul that we are all part of. So that's why it's called non-duality. It's like there's actually non-duality, but we think we are individuals. We have our own kind of ideas and feelings and personality, and we're very attached to that. But underneath that, we have this pure soul, which is identical with everybody else's pure soul, and identical with Brahman, this universal. It doesn't sound like a god, a person, but more like the universal soul, universal principle. It's called, so Brahman is the universal principle, the one eternal, undifferentiated self, a luminous consciousness. And if we realize that, that's how we become liberated. They talk about liberation, nirvana. So liberation is when you realize your own self, your own soul is one with everybody else's soul, one with Brahman. Actually sounds kind of beautiful.
Hippie, nice. Yeah, it's nice.
Hippie?
Yeah, it's like, it's all hippie, connected to everybody, everything is connected to you.
Yeah, and it's kind of a beautiful idea. I have to say, when I was reading it, I think, wow, what a beautiful idea. And yeah, I can see that if you did have this experience, you'd feel really blissful, and you'd also feel really connected with everybody else, and love and compassion, so it would be a really beautiful thing.
But it's just in one school though.
Yeah, so this is, I'm just saying, this is one school, so other schools have different views, but I didn't want to go into all of them. So I'm talking about this just to give you an idea of what at least some people believed in India at the time of the Buddha. So what the Buddha did in his meditation, I mean, he probably learned about this idea. He studied with teachers and he meditated on what they taught, so he was probably influenced by this. And it said that when he was meditating under the guidance of his teachers, he was able to reach the very highest level of concentration that is available or that is possible within samsara, within cyclic existence. He reached the highest level. But he realized, but I'm still not free. I still have craving. You can see there's still craving in his mind, still ignorance in his mind. He realized this isn't it. I'm still not free. So he wanted to go further. He wanted to go beyond that. And in his meditation, he apparently realized that this idea of a soul, a self, a real, permanent, eternal essence is a fantasy. It actually doesn't exist. It's non-existent. So he refuted this idea. And I think it was probably quite a radical thing, right, to do that. And in fact, in the world, and the Dalai Lama talks about this, in all the world religions and world spiritual traditions, is there any other that that refutes the idea of a soul? I don't think so. They all say there's some kind of soul, some kind of self. They may give it different properties, talk about it in different ways, but I think Buddhism is unique in refuting that, rejecting that. And not only that, I mean, Buddha didn't just reject it because he said, oh, it's a stupid idea, but he realized it doesn't exist. It's not really there. And being attached to a self, believing in it, and holding on to it, thinking it's true, thinking it's real, that is what keeps us in samsara. So I was thinking, there's this idea that I just mentioned, that we are all one, we are all part of this universal soul and so on. Very beautiful idea. But with that idea, can you get out of samsara? If you believe in that, even if you experience it, will you be able to be free of samsara, free of this cycle of death and rebirth? So Buddha said, no, that keeps us in samsara, keeps us in this cycle of dying and being reborn. But the Buddha said, don't just believe what I'm saying. So we shouldn't say, oh, Buddha said there's no self, there's no soul, therefore it's true. Does that work? No. And he didn't want that. He didn't want people to just blindly accept what he said. He said, you check it out for yourself. You investigate. So this is what we are supposed to do. We're supposed to look into our own experience, into our own mind, and check for ourselves if there is a soul or a self. Come to our own first-hand experience of it. So, where are we for time? Where do we go? We go till 6:10, is that right?
We go till 6 and 10, I think.
Okay.
We have plenty of time.
Yeah, okay. So let's just go back a little bit to the top of page 2. When we talk about selflessness, no self, it doesn't mean absolutely there's no self at all. If there was no self at all, why would we even be sitting here talking about this, you know? So we do exist. There is some kind of self, some kind of I that does exist. So what we need to do is differentiate the kind of self or I that does exist conventionally. This is a conventional truth. Okay, there is a conventionally existing self or I, me, person, whatever we are, others. Something that does exist, but there's also a kind of self that doesn't exist. A kind of, we could call it a false self, a mistaken self, a hallucinated self, whatever. It doesn't exist. So this is what we're trying to do, is we're trying to differentiate the kind of self that does exist from the kind of self that doesn't exist. Now this kind of self that doesn't exist, why do we even have to talk about it? It's because our mind creates it. Not deliberately, not consciously, not because we learned it from our parents or we learned it from our teachers in school. It's part of our ignorance that's been there in our mind way, from beginningless time. So we have this ignorance that's always been there in our mind, and it creates or produces or fabricates an idea of self, a sense of self that actually doesn't exist, like hallucination. So this is what we need to recognize. So letter E, this is according to my teachers, how they explain it. The terminology, it's helpful to look at the terminology. Sometimes we say self, sometimes we say I, sometimes we say person. So my teachers say that, point number 1, there's 4 terms that are synonymous. Person, self, I, being. So those 4 terms are synonymous. I can say I am a person, I am a self, I am an I am a being. Okay, and this doesn't only apply to human beings. I think in the West, we say person. We're only talking about people, human beings, but not in Buddhism. Animals are persons too. I mean, many people believe that. Of course, my dog is a person, especially in America. But also flies and mosquitoes and all the other kinds of beings that are explained in Buddhism, things we can't see, like hungry ghosts and devas and hell beings. Okay, so any kind of being, sentient being. They also have this term sentient being. Sentient being, it means a being that has a mind, that knows, that feels, that experiences things. Okay, so it's not just human beings.
Person and sentient beings is the same?
Sorry?
No. Person and sentient being is the same?
No.
Why not? Yes, it is.
I don't think
זה כולל בפנים, אבל זה לא גם. זה גם, זה לא רק.
Let's you reply.
What did she say? What did you
What
say?
did you say? Say it in English.
I said that sentient beings includes animals, flies, everything. Not only persons.
Not plants.
Not plants.
According to Buddhism, plants are not sentient beings. Yeah. No, there is a difference.
Yeah.
Sentient beings are beings that are not Buddhas.
Not Buddhas?
No, but
They say, I know, I don't know why. I mean, the Buddha has a mind, of course, but when they use the term sentient beings, for example, like, I want to attain enlightenment to help all sentient beings. So in that case, sentient beings means everybody who's not a Buddha. Buddhas are special. I mean, of course they're sentient, they have minds, but they are Anyway, the term sentient being refers to all beings other than Buddhas. So it's human beings and animals and insects and fish and birds and hungry ghosts and hell beings and devas. And also bodhisattvas and arhats. So they are out of samsara. Well, at least the arhats, they're out of samsara. High-level bodhis. So they are also sentient beings. So everybody below a Buddha. All beings below Buddhas.
How does it?
Whereas, I mean, your original question, but Buddha, even though Buddha is not a sentient being, he is a person. He is a person. He is a being. He's not a sentient being, he's a being. And I don't know why. I mean, don't ask me. I didn't make up this terminology. But it is good to know, because if you're reading the texts, sometimes they do get very precise about these things.
Lloyd, what would be
Huh?
Lloyd, what would be the definition of person and what would be the definition of sentient being?
It's right here. Definition of a person. Number 2. Definition of a person. The I that is imputed in dependence on 4 or 5 aggregates. That's what a person is. Huh? What?
And then is the definition of sentient beings in Lloyd?
What are you saying? Lower?
Lowering.
Lower?
No, it's not lowering, I think it's starting.
Dura, sorry.
The definition.
Dura.
Is the definition of sentient
I don't know. I haven't studied Dura that much. I don't know if they have a definition of a sentient being. But this is a definition of a person. And since person, self, I, and being are synonymous, then I think this definition would apply to all of them. And then sentient being would be a person who's not Buddha. A being who's not a Buddha. So anyway, this definition of a person is agreed on by all the Buddhist schools. All Buddhist schools say that a person is just what is imputed in dependence on 4 or 5 aggregates. So, you know about the aggregates?
Sorry, what did you
Aggregates? You know about the aggregates? Huh? I mean, it's a Buddhist thing. Actually, apparently it was also existing before the Buddha. So this system of dividing a person into these 5 aggregates. So there's the body. I mean, a simple way is just body and mind, if you want to be simple. Body and mind. The first aggregate is form, which is the body, our physical body. So all the skin, blood, bones, cells, molecules, atoms. This is the first aggregate. Second, so the other 4 aggregates are all mental. They're all parts of the mind. Feelings. Every moment we have either a pleasant, an unpleasant, or a neutral feeling. So that's ever present. Every moment we have a feeling. The third one, discrimination. Sometimes it's called discernment or recognition. So this is also there every moment. And it's that part of the mind that can tell one thing from another. We look at these flowers. Okay, we can see this one is yellow, and this one is dark pink, and this one is light pink, and this is green, and so on. So we can differentiate colors, we can differentiate different kinds of objects. That's a chair, this is a microphone. So it doesn't mean that we are labeling. It's not labeling necessarily, because this can happen just with seeing or hearing. Just whenever we see something or we hear something, we know without labeling, without giving a name. We just know one thing from another. We can distinguish one thing from another. And then conception comes along and says, that's yellow, that's a chair, that's a man, that's a dog. But before conception, even before that kind of conception, the mind, just the sensory consciousnesses are able to know one thing from another. And that's the function of this third aggregate discrimination. And the fourth aggregate is called Compositional Factors. That includes all the other mental factors. So I don't know if you've studied mental factors, but it's a very interesting thing. There's negative states of mind, like desire and aversion and, jealousy and laziness and so on. And then there's virtuous ones, like faith and equanimity and non-attachment. So there's some that are virtuous, some that are non-virtuous, some that are kind of neutral, like mindfulness. Mindfulness is a mental factor. Concentration is a mental factor. Wisdom is a mental factor. There's lots of different mental factors, and they're all included in that fourth aggregate. And then consciousness, the fifth one, are 6 types of main minds related to our 6 senses, eye and so forth. So that means seeing, just to put it in plain language, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling in our body, tactile sensations. And then the sixth consciousness is called the mental consciousness. So that includes all our thoughts, our memories, our dreams, our fantasies, all of that kind of experience. So, just briefly, those are the 5 aggregates. So, a person is made up of these 5 aggregates, or simply body and mind. And then on top of that, or in relation to that, or in dependence on that, we say I, if it's myself, you, if it's you, she, he, David, Jonathan, Maria, whatever. Okay, we have names, we have labels. So it's just what is labeled in relation to a collection, a combination of 5 aggregates. And the reason they're called aggregate, the word aggregate, it actually means heap. The word skanda, the Sanskrit word skanda, it means heap, like a pile. It's a big heap. Because each aggregate is composed of many, many things.
Mitzvah.
Not just one thing, but many things.
In Hebrew it's quite accurate. Mitzvah.
Okay.
It's a collection of things.
Collection, yeah. Collection.
Why 4 or 5 aggregates?
Good question. Because there are some beings that don't have bodies. No,
No, meditation.
they have bodies. They have subtle bodies. No, there's a kind of being, there's a realm called the Formless Realm. And it's way up at the top of samsara. In the sense that you have to develop super strong concentration and develop your concentration to such a high degree you get born in that realm. When you're in that realm, you have only mind, no body, no physical body. But it's still samsara. It's very blissful, very peaceful, but it's still samsara. You're not free of samsara, you still have karma. You stay there for a long time and then you die, your karma runs out, you die, and then back down again. Back down to planet Earth or somewhere else. So this is talking about the self that does exist, the person that does exist, what does exist, okay? And it's important to know that, because when you start talking about selflessness, you start talking about emptiness, if you're not careful, it's easy to slip off the edge into what's called nihilism. I don't know how to pronounce it, you know? You think, there's nothing, I don't exist, nobody exists, nothing is here. And I mean, when I first went to Dharamsala back in 1973, there were not so many Western people there at the time, but I heard, people told me, I didn't meet this person, but people told me there was this one Western woman who had been there for a while studying, and she learned about emptiness, and I guess she was meditating on emptiness, and she ended up thinking, I don't exist. She got into this state of mind where she really believed she didn't exist, nothing existed, and she became like a vegetable.
She wasn't happy about it?
She didn't do anything. She didn't do anything. She didn't eat, she didn't sleep, she didn't take care of herself. She was just in this nihilistic state of mind. Eventually they had to take her to a mental hospital. Because she just really thought. And she thought this is the meaning of emptiness. She thought she understood emptiness. But what she understood was, I don't exist. Nothing exists. I mean, you become like a zombie, I think. So this can happen. I don't know how frequently that happens, but it can happen, and it's dangerous, very dangerous. You can be in the mental hospital the rest of your life. Or what they say actually in the teachings is if you think that way, you can become very irresponsible. You can think, there's no karma. I don't exist, you don't exist, I don't like you, I'm going to kill you. You don't exist anyway, so it doesn't matter. So, well, I guess that kind of thing can happen. People just start doing anything. So that's the worst thing. Then you start creating all this bad karma and end up worse than before. So we want to be careful to avoid that. So that's why it's important to know what does exist. So what does exist, body. We do have a body. We do have a body. And we do have a mind. We do have all these different parts of our mind, feelings, discriminations, other mental factors, consciousness. So these do exist. And we can, so the self, the person that does exist is just like a convention. It's just like a convenient way of referring, I'm here and you were there, she is there, he is there, you know, so we have different terms. Pronouns, proper names, titles, president, prime minister, general, king, queen, Dalai Lama. Okay, so we have these different terms that we use to refer to people. But other than that, there isn't a self, an I, like a real permanent. This is what we think, this is what we feel, especially when we get emotional. When we're insulted or, you know, somebody takes something that belongs to us, or they accuse us of doing something that we didn't do. So then big strong feeling of I comes up. Me, how dare you talk to me like that, you know. So when there's strong emotions, at that time, there's a strong feeling of a real I. Something that's more than just this combination of five aggregates, body and mind. Something else. Do you know what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's what we're looking for. That's like the target. That feeling of self, that sense of self. But like I say, there's different levels of it. There's a coarser, wrong sense of self, and there's a subtler one, and there's a very subtle one. The very subtle one is the one talked about by the Prasangika, the Madhyamika Prasangika. That's the one you usually hear about. Inherently existing self, independently existing self. But that's like way down at the bottom. It's a bit like Russian dolls. You know Russian dolls? No. What do you call it?
Babushka.
Babushka. Babushka.
The Russian call it Matushka. Babushka is a grandmother in Russian. So the Russian call it Matushka.
But anyway, I'm talking about these little dolls. So you have one on the outside and you take it apart, and then there's another one inside, and you take that one apart. So eventually, what it was, eventually get down to one tiny one.
Very subtle one.
But I think eventually here you would get down to, oh, there's nothing there. No, there would be the relative, the conventionally existing self, the I that does exist right down at the bottom. That's the conventionally existing self. But then on top of that, you know, our mind fabricates another one, and then another one, and another one. So we have like layers of self, I, feelings about I, that are actually not true, that are just fabricated by the mind. So we need to work through these one by one. So the first level, the most gross or coarse level, the outer doll, the Russian dolls, is this one I was just talking about, this permanent, unitarian, independent self. Okay? Now, Lama Tsongkhapa says, not everybody believes in that. Not everybody has that. Only people who have studied in some philosophical tradition, like these Hindu ones. But I wonder, if we were brought up, raised in Judaism or Christianity, I was told I have a soul when I was a kid,
Yeah.
In Judaism also, you're told you have a soul.
But it's not that emphasized, I think, like in Christianity.
You
It
light
seems
a
to be.
candle to the soul. When a person dies, you light a candle.
Yeah. But I also remember...
Our Buddha nature is not soul, kind of.
Now this is an interesting point, and let's leave that for later, okay? Yeah, because I was reading also in Wikipedia, that among, in Buddhism, in the past, but also at the present, there's this whole idea of selflessness is quite controversial. And there are some Buddhists who say, well, there is a kind of self, like the Buddha nature. Or there's one movement in Thailand, it's called the Dhammakaya movement. It's like a modern, contemporary movement, and it's very, very popular. And they talk about Nirvana as a self. Nirvana is the true self. But it's very controversial. Others are saying, oh, they're heretics, they're wrong. So it's a kind of controversial topic.
Also, what is the thing that goes from life to life?
Well, this is another thing, yeah.
No, so if there is no seed there is nothing existing. Only
mind.
Mind.
Maybe the mind is another word of saying soul.
The mind is inside the soul leaves it, the mind stays.
It's
The
only
soul changes, mind continues.
Well, that's a simple way of saying it, because the idea of, what I just mentioned about this Atman, the way it's explained in Hinduism, it's permanent. It doesn't change. It's always the same. Is the mind like that? Is the mind unchanging?
No.
But if there is the thing that goes on, okay,
It's not a thing.
like that.
It's not a thing. A thing is something that doesn't move, doesn't change, nothing happens.
Well, it depends on what you mean by thing.
Conventionally,
Yeah. No, but this is a really important point. It is an important point, because Buddhism talks about karma and reincarnation. So how do you explain that? And there's no self, no soul. Wait a minute.
That's a martial
No, because karma spoke about it in the retreat. This is something that it's not.
That is the thing. So when in conception, that you have the three parts comes together, and that thing that is not coming from the mother or the father.
Well, there are different explanations in Buddhism. Not everybody, again, like I said before, not everybody gives the same answers. So there are different answers to this question. It's complicated. But generally, in a general way, we would say the mind, or part of the mind, not all of the mind. Because like our sense consciousnesses, our, seeing and hearing and smelling and so on, those don't go to the next life. Okay? But the mental consciousness, some kind of mental consciousness. When in Tantra, I don't know if you had teachings on Tantra, but they say it's the very subtle mind, the clear light mind. It's a very, 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 very subtle level of the mind. So as we're dying, the mind kind of collapses from the more gross to the subtle, and then to the very subtle, this very subtle clear light mind. And that's what goes to the next life. But it's not a soul, because it's impermanent, changes. So it doesn't have these characteristics that people who believe in a soul believe. So it is something, but not a soul. It doesn't qualify for a soul. And it's also changing moment by moment. And it's not like a real me, who I really am, my real essence.
It's also.
Well, let's go back to talking about this very coarse level of self, a permanent, unitary, independent self. This kind of question is an important question, but let's leave it for later, because I think the more we understand, what does exist relatively, relative level of things about a person, then it gets easier to understand that sticky question. Sticky, tricky question. Okay. Okay, so I wanted to lead a meditation on it, but I'll wait till after the break. We'll have a break first, and then you can refresh yourselves, and then we'll do a meditation on this. So we might have this feeling, this sense of a self that is permanent, unitary, independent, either because of our upbringing, because of our culture, because of maybe our own ideas also. You might just think on your own and come up with this kind of idea. So it's still good to check. It's good to check if it's true or not, if it exists or not. So, like I said, we'll do a meditation on this, and I'll have you just try to get in touch with a sense of self, sense of I, especially the one that comes up really strong when we're emotional, either upset or excited, something wonderful happens, or frightened. Okay, so at those times, the feeling of self becomes much more apparent, much more strong. It seems really, really vivid, like we could swear that it exists. Really, it's there, it exists. When we're just kind of in a calm state of mind, nothing much happening, relaxed, then it's harder to see the sense of self that we have. It's good to think of times when we're emotional, and it's more clear. So then we'll look at that, and then we'll just ask ourselves, is this permanent? Is this something permanent, unchanging, never changes from one moment to the next? Is that possible? And we'll check to see if it's unitary in the sense of one partless thing, or does it have parts? Are there different parts to it? And the third one, independent. Now, independent here means doesn't depend on causes and conditions. So that means it would be totally unaffected by anything. No matter what happens with the weather or what other people do to us or say to us, it wouldn't affect. We wouldn't be affected. Totally untouchable, unaffected by anything else. So is that possible, such a thing? Also, it would have to be separate from our body and mind. Something other than our body and mind. Something completely disconnected. Because again, if it is somehow connected with our body and mind, that means it would be impermanent rather than permanent. It means it would be dependent on causes and conditions rather than independent. So it's kind of a simple idea, a simple reasoning, but it is helpful to eventually later get to the more subtle kind of selflessness or emptiness explained by the Madhyamika. So that's why it's a helpful step towards understanding the subtler one. So maybe we could... Any questions before we have a break?
Many questions, but they will be answered, surely. So.
Okay, well, let's have a break. After the break, we'll do this meditation, and then you can ask whatever questions. So about 20 minutes.